So my name is Andrew Fuqua. There's my contact information. Feel free to connect to me on LinkedIn or tweet at me or email me or call me or whatever. I'll be glad to help you guys in any way I can. And so this talk is acceptance test-driven development, behavior-driven development, story testing, specification by example, whatever. Add examples to acceptance criteria. So let me start this off by a poll and asking you to raise your hands. And the first question is, how many of you are tired of the speakers asking you to raise your hands about stuff? Not a single person. That's fantastic. So the rest of you are just being just not raising your hands based on principle. So I've sat through some talks today, and I found myself, yeah, okay, maybe I didn't hear the question, but I'm not raising my hand either way. I do that. It's fun for the speaker. It's good interaction. It helps me know where people are at. I'll try to avoid the hand raising and just ask you to give me short answers to questions. All right. So this is intended to be somewhat of an introductory talk. If you're doing Cucumber and Gherkin already, and if you're using Fitness already, then you may know more than me, and I invite you to stay and participate and share your examples, or if that's just going to be boring to you, feel free to go. We got one taker already. I am going to share some thoughts and some examples and some tips that aren't necessarily for beginners. So I hope that even if you are using those things, hopefully you'll get something out of it. The other reason you may want to leave is because I'm not Roy. I think in the printed materials, there's a different guy that was going to do a talk, but he had to cancel, so I'm filling in with a different talk. So if you're here to see whatever's in the printed book, that's probably not what you're going to get. So here we go. So these things are just from the start. For the practitioner, the difference between these things are immaterial. So the expert or the teacher or the book author would say, yeah, there's some differences in the way they look at things or the emphasis, but effectively it's all about the same kind of stuff. So whichever name you want it to go by is fine by me. And by the way, if you saw me talk about ATDD at AQAA about a year or two ago, this is the same talk updated a little bit. But if you saw that one, you've already heard my pitch. So I don't know if that applies to you or not. So again, I'm not offended if anybody needs to walk out. If this isn't what you need, go use the law of 2 feet and go get what you need. Okay, so why do we have defects? This is the participatory part of the talk. Why do we have defects? Anybody? Programmer error. Okay. Improper understanding of the requirements. Why else? Not enough acceptance criteria. Why else? Y'all are just pandering to me. Assumptions? But you mean bad assumptions? Okay, good. What else? Inadequate test. Let me go back to assumptions. Bad assumptions about what? Bad requirements? Okay, so we can have bad, how it's supposed to work, how it should work, but we also could have bad assumptions about the technology, about the code. I might have a bad assumption about how grid bag layout works. That's not hard to do. So yeah, a lot of misunderstanding about the code, misunderstanding about other technical aspects, misunderstanding the requirements. I think surely maybe there are some other reasons, but most often in my mind, it comes down to misunderstanding. So how can we reduce defect? I want to single in on just the code and technology for a moment. How can we reduce misunderstandings about the code and about technology? Come to an agreement up front, like what? Make sure what's intended is known, get everybody on the same page, establish terminology. Okay, and I'm trying to get you to think technical and think about code. Think XP. Write some unit tests. Great. Peer review. I was hoping somebody would say pair programming. Yeah, pair programming would help out a lot. Certainly. So, and TDD, test-driven development, refactoring, paying down technical debt, all of those things. So it's been, I was about to say it's been solved. It's not been solved in everybody's code base, but we know how to reduce misunderstanding about technology and code, at least to a great deal. So that's the last I'm going to talk about technology and code misunderstanding today. I'm going to shift the focus now to talk more about the misunderstanding of the requirements. But yes, pair programming, using solid design principles, TDD are great approaches to avoid misunderstanding about the technology. So what other problems or bad side effects come out of misunderstanding? And I'm talking about the requirements now. Wasted effort. Loss of face or loss of trust in your client. Time and opportunity cost. What else? Say that again, please. Yeah, so we could miss the business problem. There's business cost to it. So there's also tension and mistrust that comes out of this, right? People tend to assume the worst in other people. Particularly when it's like the business people versus the techies, and they don't speak the same language and aren't on the same page and don't have the same experiences and life experiences and work experiences anyway. Those coders are lazy, or those coders they just want a gold plate or over architect, or they wanted to do their own thing, and they're just, it's them. The problem is them. It's not me. And I'm not trying to fuel that. I'm just pointing it out that that we do assume the worst in others, and it goes the other way as well. It goes that way from the technology people to the business people, to the product owner, and say, he can't communicate. He changed his mind. He's wishy-washy. He doesn't communicate well. He's changing his mind and blaming it on us. So I just want to make you aware that we have that tendency to think of the worst in other people. And I want you to try to be aware of it and change your mind around that, and try to have empathy for the other people that you're working for, and defeat against that. But anyway, so going on from there, so how can we prevent misunderstanding of the requirements? Talk. You've already given me some of them. I think somebody said acceptance criteria. How else? Examples, yeah. Right, that's the thrust of this talk. If you come out of here with at least an increased awareness of examples, of the examples that are around you already, then that will be a win for me. If you can note the examples that are already in the air and write them down and talk about them and use them, then that's the thrust of the talk, and you'll get value. So very good. That would be, if you can do that, that'll be time well spent. So through examples, fantastic. And we already use examples. Okay, so the customer goes and the BA or the product owner or the product manager or whatever goes and talks to the customer, and the customer says, well, they talk about how do you do your job, what do you do, what forms do you use, what applications do you use now, well, I use Excel. Well, show me that Excel document so I can get understanding. So, they talk about examples. They look at the forms. They look at the applications they use. They look at the databases and the Excel spreadsheets that they use today. And then what does the BA do? Well, they write down the requirements and throw the examples away, right? So, well, darn, you know, it would have helped me as a developer to actually see that example, to see that artifact. And it's insidious. We don't even realize that we're doing it. That's the job of the business analyst, is to understand the customer and write the requirements. We tell them that's what they're supposed to do. And it's no good to just hand the developer the example document. It needs the requirement written around it, so those examples often get lost. QA also has examples. They have lots of examples in their test cases, but they don't share them with dev. I mean, dev doesn't want to see them anyway, and the business might not even want to look at it, and they're probably buried inside a bunch of test scripts, which are steps. So you get way down in a test script. Oh, there's an example. Oh, that's pretty cool. But they're not shared with anybody. And of course, there's a little bit of hyperbole here. I know that there are counterexamples and some people who do this a lot better. And there's some QA groups who share their test with development and they're useful. But for the most part, in my experience, development does their thing and QA does their thing, and they don't. You know, if you ask a developer to review a test suite, they're going to, oh, do I have to? You know, it's not their favorite thing to do. Okay, so QA has their own examples, and development's guilty in this too. They invent or discover all the edge cases, and they write it up in code or maybe in some TDD unit test, and then throw the examples away and don't share them with anybody else. So we're working with examples all the time. The problem is that we use different examples. And so we have misunderstandings because of this. So I want us to share examples, okay? Now, that's examples. Now I want to talk about the acceptance test-driven development process, or the flow or the workflow through which we can talk about these examples. Now, this isn't something that I would say, okay, we're in the discuss phase now, and you know, it's not a hard process. Okay, we have a checklist, we can exit the discuss phase and enter the distill phase. It's not like that at all. It's more, you know, it's kind of like backlog grooming, when you're all the time, you're refining your stories, you're fixing up your acceptance criteria, you're improving your examples all the time. Continuous backlog refinement. Well, this is the same kind of thing. While you're writing your stories and refining them and grooming your backlog, you're going to all the time be switching between the discuss, distill, develop, and demo phases. Okay, so this is not my chart. I've stolen it from some other people. That you can see at the bottom of the slide there. Very smart people. Anything that you can read by them is I can recommend. So the discuss phase, we start with some story. We bring everybody together that would have interest in the story. We start discussing it, and we talk it through. So suppose I have this story. Suppose the story is users are required to use secure passwords. If I handed this to you, what might you want to know? What does secure mean? Yeah, and so what else might you want to know? Who are your users? Which users? Yes, what else? Password to what? Yes. What else? What does required mean? What was the one in the back? Well, yeah. What are the error scenarios? How do you want to handle those? What do you do if I'm wrong? Yeah. So there's all kinds of questions you're going to ask, and so you're already doing this kind of stuff. If you're handed a user story like this, you have some questions, and you want somebody to provide the acceptance criteria for you. Certainly, so let's see if we covered everything that I thought of. Which users? Is it the same for users with low permissions as those for admins? Is it the same for login to certain areas of the system as it is to the community forums? What does secure mean? Length restrictions, max or minimum? Special characters, which characters? What about easy to guess passwords like P at SSWORD? Things that are susceptible to dictionary attacks. When exactly? Is this when we are creating an account, or what about existing accounts? Must they change their password on the next login if it isn't secure? And error messages. So yeah, all these things should come up in the discussion, and I would assume all of you are doing that to some extent. And so we may come up with a list of acceptance criteria like this. I would ask people to raise their hand and say, are you using something like this? But I'm holding myself back. So in my mind, this is the minimal standard of acceptance criteria. This is, if you need to at least be doing something like this. And it's not test steps. It's not click on this, load this page, click there, click that button, then enter this, then go to there and click that radio button and see that the results are this, this, and this. Those are test steps, and those are things that you don't want in your acceptance criteria. They need to be the things that you want to verify. So when I think I'm done with the story, when I see this, 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 and this, I'm done. I can quit coding. Ken, are you having trouble with what I said about test steps? Looks like you're pondering that. Okay. Okay, I'll proceed then. So at this point, could I go code this now? Good. Why do you ask? Yep. So sure, I could. It'd be better to get examples for each part of the business rule. It'd be better to discuss this a little bit more. So yeah, absolutely. We do all the time. We go, at this point, we do absolutely go code, but there's still opportunity for those misunderstandings that we talked about earlier. So let's dig a little deeper. And I've already talked about this, the test scripts. I don't like to see test scripts and acceptance criteria. The test scripts are about the how something is supposed to be, it's about the how or the what. It's about the wrong thing, whatever it is. So I prefer the verify that style or examples or even Gherkin, which I'm going to explain in a little bit. So here's what I was looking for. Scripts are about the how. The why is often forgotten or hidden, and the how changes more often than the business rules. So that's my thinking on that. So suppose we talk about examples for this user story, and we come up with these examples. Okay, so here are some examples of some good and some bad passwords. This is hypothetical. This isn't, go out and implement this tomorrow. But I've found that when we do this, we surprisingly often come up with things where we weren't on the same page, or we'll come up with we'll discover additional business rules. So that means what I'm saying is that we can discover that the story is bigger than we originally thought, and we have to decide what to do about it. Do we expand the scope, or do we split the story? Do we, push half of that off later? Well, at least you can have that discussion. You can decide whether to add it to scope. You got to have a fighting chance of making a story and identifying it, and being explicit about some part of this discussion that you're not going to implement, rather than the testers thinking, oh, of course we're going to prevent dictionary attacks, where the developer thinks that's too hard to code. I'm not doing that. So these examples, talking through these examples, spurs good conversations. All right. So then ask yourself, do I have an example for each part of the business rule? And then we can go on to the next sort of phase of this ATDD cycle for this particular story. So we have a whole bunch of examples, and the next step is to distill it. And that's to distill it down to the bare minimum. So why might we want to reduce it to the bare minimum? Why not just keep all the examples? The examples are good, right? And if we automate these things that, the computer runs fast, let's just have them all. It covers all cases in case something changes later. The maintenance cost and the redundancy can be pretty big. Yeah, you're absolutely right. If I have more examples than I need, it takes longer to read it, to read it in the test, wherever you're recording the examples. It takes longer to maintain, it takes longer to understand, and you want just one example for every aspect of the business rule. You don't want too many. And if you think about it, you want to build these things up and automate them, and so the computers can run pretty fast, but you want to be able to run the test all the time, and you want to be able to get the answer from the test suite in a matter of seconds. If it takes, if it flips over into minutes, you're not going to run them all the time. So we want fast feedback, and we do need to keep it to the bare minimum. So that distilling step is very important. One example per equivalence class, make sure you're covering boundary conditions and edge cases, the normal use, and you need to talk about the abnormal but reasonable use as well as the abnormal but unreasonable use, and make an explicit decision about how you're going to handle those things and if you are. Okay, if you do this, if you come up with examples and start using acceptance test driven ATDD and use examples, you'll notice that you start coming up with the language of the business, a ubiquitous language. You'll start agreeing to what terms mean. You'll reduce the misunderstanding about certain terms. And you actually do need to not only avoid programmer jargon, but avoid loose synonyms, things that are, the business may use loose synonyms all the time, but we can train the business to, let's make a dictionary of terms and make sure we're all on the same page and use these terms consistently and not use the loose synonyms. The use of domain-driven design, there's a great book by Eric Evans, using that concept, even if you don't follow it to the T, just get your programmers to read it and become aware of the concept and use the language of the business in your code. It should show up in your designs, it should show up in your classes and your methods, and the programmer should use that same terminology. So get everybody on the same page to help reduce some of the misunderstanding. Use the language of the business, and you can build that up. Also, automation will make you force the issue. If you automate these examples, if you automate these tests, you will want to reuse some of the tests and reuse some of the components, particularly when you get to start using Cucumber or fitness, or I'm going to explain Gherkin in a little bit. Once you start automating from these examples, you'll want to reuse components, and that'll force people to have this ubiquitous language and get on the same page. All right, so here is an example with Gherkin, and I'm going to show you the example of Gherkin, then I'll explain what Gherkin is. So here is an example from a place I actually worked, and this would be two acceptance tests for a given scenario. The Free Popcorn Tuesday scenario, and this is of course from a movie theater. You go on Tuesday, you buy you buy a movie ticket, you get a coupon for free popcorn, you go to the concession stand and you get your free popcorn. So given it's Tuesday, when I buy at least one movie ticket, then I should get a coupon for a free small popcorn. So this is an example with Gherkin. And so, you could say, well, what happens if I buy 2 movie tickets? Or what if I buy something other, a gift card? And then so you could write scenarios for each one of those examples as well. Given it's Tuesday, let's see. Okay, so I don't have reusable components yet. I'll show you that in a minute. So this given when then, you may recognize as an arrange, act, assert. And if arrange, act, assert is meaningful to you, then great. If it's not, then it's no big deal. But the given is I'm setting up the system under test, and I'm arranging the system. The when is the act, when I press a button. So if I were to automate this stuff, that when should trigger some behavior to happen or some action to happen in my system. And the then is the thing that I want to assert or the thing that I want to check. So that's that. So here's another sample feature in Gherkin. This is about an online bookseller where booksellers can go add in books that they want to be put up for sale and through some kind of an admin system. And this is related to login. So I have a correct credential scenario and an incorrect credential scenario. And so given the bookseller login is activated, you'll notice is in both of these scenarios. So if I were to code this, if I were to turn this into an automated test, I only have to code the given the bookseller login is activated once, and I can reuse it in multiple tests. And this comes back to that ubiquitous language and being consistent and developing a domain-specific language. And this would be a domain-specific language for this particular application. The bookseller login is activated as a domain-specific concept. And so because we're careful with our language, we can reuse that component. Likewise, maybe something like, there's some other repeated things in here, and I'll show you some parameterization in a minute. So these bold words are reserved words in Gherkin. Given, when, then, and. I think there's even an or. There's a couple of others. Feature is a reserved word. Everything after the word feature is ignored. It's basically a comment. It's documentation. Everything after the scenario is likewise just sort of like a label or an identifier when things fail. And the things after given, when, and then are actually linked to test methods or fixture code, glue code between your acceptance test and your system that's under test. Okay, so there's a sample feature. But notice that business people can read this stuff. You can show this to your product owner or your manager or the stakeholder or the subject matter expert or whoever is in the business that wants you to build something for them. You can show that to them and they can say, yeah, that's what I want. They can read it. They can understand it. And it's also executable because we're writing it in Gherkin. And by the way, if anybody cares, Gherkin's been translated into, 50 languages or something. So I don't know what it would be in Spanish, but there's equivalents in other languages if anybody cares. So Gherkin is a business-readable, domain-specific language that lets you describe a software's behavior without detailing how that behavior is implemented. Serves two purposes, documentation and automation. So the documentation part is I can write these specs and have the business people verify that that's what it's supposed to be. The testers and the developers can be on the same page, be in agreement about what's supposed to be done. And we can also automate from it. Gherkin is the language that Cucumber understands, and Cucumber is a behavior-driven development test automation tool. Okay, so I just said a mouthful of stuff. Maybe that's kind of gobbledygook at this point. I'm looking to see if there's any questions. I think it'll become more clear with the next few slides. All right, so I've shown the Gherkin type of examples, the given, it's Tuesday, when I buy a movie ticket, I should get a coupon for a free popcorn, that kind of example. But some things are just data, and a table would be great, you know? Let me just have a spreadsheet of data as an example. In a lot of cases, that makes more sense than that kind of wordy approach. So these are great examples. So, and you can see with the pipes, I've obviously coded this in a wiki, right? This is a wiki-driven table. This first one is calling a method called division. It's passing in a couple of arguments. And the question mark there after the quotient is saying that that's the expected result. and I can put this in fitness, or I can put this in a number of other ATDD tools and run it, and out to the end, it'll either show me green or red. If I got a different number, it'd show the actual value out to the right. And so this is so each one of those things would be a call to the division method. Another type of table is just it's a query. You say, what's the current state of the system, and it dumps out the current state of the system. And what you code in your test is what you expect, and then it would show red and green lines and extra lines if there's differences. And so the first one is like an input-output mapping. Here are some inputs and the output that comes out of the system. And the second one is kind of a query. Another thing that you can do with tables is just actions, like a script. Do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, and they should all succeed, and do this one last thing and check a result. So all of those types of things you can do in tables with the test automation frameworks that are available today. And so I mentioned wikis, I've mentioned fitness and fit. So fitness is spelled FITNESSE, fitness.org. It's kind of an old tool, but it still works and people still use it. There's a version for databases called dbfit, and is very much like this. You can specify queries and expected result, and it can test stored procedures and queries and all kinds of stuff. I've known some database heavy teams that used dbfit. And there's Robot Framework and Concordian and Cucumber. Lots of tools support the table-driven kind of approach to examples. Okay, what's cool is you can marry these two. You can use Gherkin in tables. You can put templatize your Gherkin prose and attach a table to it. So instead of writing a bunch of different scenarios, writing this text over and over again for $50 and $100 and $200 and changing the outcome around, you can attach a table to it. So I think that's pretty cool. And again, so this is stuff supported by many of the tools out there. Okay, so usability examples. There's examples in usability as well. They may be hard to test, but ask any UI designer to show you a page he likes, and he's going to, for the next 30 minutes, you're going to be, okay, I'm done now. So there's examples in usability as well. And so even though you can't automate them, there's still value in the communication. There's still value in the example. So ask for an example. Show me what you mean. Is what I'm encouraging you to do. All right. So who does this and when do they do it? This distilling and discussion. So it could be different in different organizations, but my recommendation is that the product owner team is responsible for the user stories and the acceptance criteria. So the product owner team should write these. And whether it be tables or Gherkin or whatever. But the key thing to note is that when I say product owner team, I mean something specific. I mean the product owner, a business analyst, tester, and a tech lead, a techie of some sort, an architect, a developer. I said in my other talk this morning that the product owner role is a very big role. It's a difficult role, and it's a time-consuming role, and product owners should not act alone. They need help, and you need to give them an explicit team, an explicit set of people to help them out. So a business analyst is great. If you don't have them, even if you do have them, what I love is I think if you could do this, that'd be a huge win. Get your testers acting out in front of development. Get them to test the requirements before they're handed to the developers to code. Get your tester to work with your product owner, look at the acceptance criteria, improve the acceptance criteria, participate in coming up with examples, and then lean heavily on your developers to automate a lot of testing. and reduce the amount of manual testing that you have. Move QA up the food chain is what I'm trying to say. And this is important. You need this cognitive diversity to write good examples. Everybody thinks differently. QA thinks differently. That's why we have them. They think differently than developers and even differently than the business people. And you need that diversity when to come up with good examples. Very important. The developers also are, from time to time, you'll be talking to them and you'll see their eyes get big and say, "Oh, well, that's really hard. That doubles the size of this requirement." Well, you need to know that, and you need to look out for those kinds of things. So, getting a subset of your team, not the whole team, but a subset of your team, supporting your product owner in grooming the backlog and writing these acceptance criteria is a really good idea before you enter sprint planning. I say don't let QA or development do this by themselves. What I'm saying is don't let, if you turn over the test automation or if you turn ATDD over to QA or dev, they're going to pull out the tool that they like. They're going to pull out Mercury, or they're going to pull out IntelliJ, or they're going to pull out Eclipse or TFS, and they're going to code it in their little tool, and the business people aren't going to be able to read the test and aren't going to be able to validate that's what they want. You're going to have licensing problems. Developers don't have licenses to Mercury, or testers don't have licenses to Visual Studio, and they can't read it anyway. So this really needs to be a partnership between the business and QA and development to really get the value out of it. Let's see if I missed to say anything. Okay. I mentioned grooming, and I'm going to assume that some of you weren't in my talk this morning, and I mentioned a little sidebar about grooming, and I feel compelled to mention it again. A lot of times when I'm coaching teams, I'm getting them working with Scrum, and I talk about grooming, and you need to have some grooming meetings. You need to groom every week. The next thing I know is that they'll schedule a grooming meeting. They bring the whole team in, and they groom. The first time anybody sees the story is in the grooming meeting, and they spend a lot of time arguing over stories and splitting them with everybody watching as the BA type stuff into Jira or Rally or version 1 or whatever tool you're using. And it's a colossal waste of time. And my point is that grooming is not a meeting. Grooming is an activity. Story grooming, backlog refinement, whatever you want to call it, is something that happens all the time, and it can happen at your desk. But if you say, "Hey, I've got a technical lead, maybe the tech lead or the senior technical guy, on somebody identified on the team, and your senior QA are assigned to be on the product owner team," then the product owner can communicate with just a couple people and say, "Hey, I've written these stories. I've made a first pass at the acceptance criteria. Take a look, fix it up, let me know what you think." And the other folks can groom that sitting at their desk. You don't have to come together for a meeting to groom that story. If the story's fine, nobody says anything. If the story's not fine, maybe somebody fixes it, or maybe they get up out of their seat, walk over to the product owner and talk to them about it. If the story ends up being too big, then they can have a conversation about splitting the story. And so, yeah, sure, that product owner team may need to come together from time to time to talk about a new batch of stories that they just wrote, or a batch of stories that they just groomed, and they may want to skim through a list of 10 stories and say, "Hey, are these stories ready to be estimated? Are these stories ready for sprint planning? Do they meet our definition of ready?" So, yeah, you may need to bring the team together from time to time for that kind of stuff. But the point is that you've groomed outside of bringing the whole team together and sit and watch somebody type stuff into Jira and scratch their head and debate a story. So grooming is not a meeting. All right. So when I do this with my clients, I'll allocate 2 or 3 hours, and I'll have an activity at this point, and I have everybody write some Gherkin for some of their tests. I have them think about some examples. I don't have time for that. But so if you guys tune me out for the rest of the time and start writing examples, that would be fine by me. That would be a win. And you'd get value out of it. Perhaps more value than the rest of the slides if you actually put pen to paper or fingers to keyboards and started writing some examples. I think that would be wonderful. But I'm going to have to move on. I end at 5. I started at 4. I end at 5:15. Thank you very much. I had that written on a card, but it's not in front of me. So to remind me, okay, 5:15. Thank you. Okay, so automation. So yes or no? Should we automate this stuff? Well, executable specifications rock. If we can write a specification that the business can read, that we can directly execute because we're using a tool that understands Gherkin, oh wow, how cool is that? That is really, really slick. But you don't have to, and that execution is, it does require extra work and extra learning and time and training, and some organizations just aren't ready for this. Or maybe your organization is doing test-driven development so well that you might think that there's little additional value in automating these as well. I don't know. Or maybe you've already got invested in a huge suite of Selenium tests, poking the system through the UI, and you feel this would be redundant, or you're not ready for it. Okay, fine. Don't automate from your Gherkin if that's the case. But it's still useful in identifying these examples and developing a ubiquitous language, a domain-specific language for your tests, because there's huge value in the collaboration and the understanding that comes out of it. And in addition to the living specification, I've worked on probably one product that had and maintained a specification of the product long-term. It was a lot of extra work, a lot of overhead, but every component in the system had a workbook that described all the methods and all the classes. Actually, it wasn't object-oriented, so it wasn't classes. All the modules and how they worked. And it was too technical and not very valuable. It was more of a functional technical specification rather than a business specification. And a lot of the business specifications that I've seen that were written aren't maintained because, hey, here's something I want you to build, go build it, and then that specification is not really useful anymore because we keep building stuff, and the as built differs from the as requested, because as we get into it, we discover things and we do things differently than intended. But if you kind of follow this rigor, you'll end up with a living document that's always updated, that people can go to and say, what's the business rule? How is this thing supposed to work? And it's high enough level to not be too hard to maintain, especially if we automate, but it's low enough to be useful and get into some details. And we've distilled it down to the bare minimum, so we don't have too many examples. So I love it. It's a great idea, but I'm being upfront that it is something that you'd have to invest in. It doesn't come for free. So having talked a lot about testing, I don't want you to leave here misunderstanding me. ATDD is not about testing. So acceptance test-driven development is not about testing. So it's kind of a funny name, no? But it's really about the communication. It's about getting to the understanding, getting everybody on the same page. The automating examples are great, but it's not mandatory. So that said, let me talk for a little bit more about automating. So we've talked about discussing the story, get some people together, brainstorm all of the examples you can think of, the distill phase is boil it down to the bare minimum, and then we get to the develop phase. The develop phase is where we should be doing test-driven development. I won't ask you to raise your hands. But in this develop phase, we do small little test-driven development cycles. And I'm going to show you a flow chart, I think. Nope, I'm going to get to that in a few more clicks. So this discussing and distilling guides the requirements. So ATDD is about guiding the requirements and getting to understanding. TDD is about guiding the design and guiding the development. And then UAT is something that's done at the end. And so I just point that out because a lot of times people, and I know you guys don't, but a lot of times people confuse TDD and ATDD. In fact, my own company, when I said I was doing an ATDD talk, they tweeted, go see Andrew's talk on TDD at Devnexus. My own Agile company did that to me. So, oh gosh, this is being recorded. Well, okay, too late now. So anyway, now I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, so a difference in ATDD and TDD. If you're doing test-driven development, those tests should never fail. You write your test first, you get them to green, and when I say they should never fail, they should never fail in your continuous integration server. Okay, so you write a test first. It of course fails because you haven't written the code to make it pass. You write the code to make it pass. You run your unit test, your TDD. It goes green. You check it into a continuous integration server, and they should always pass in your CI server. It's different with acceptance test-driven development. The cycle is much longer. The TDD cycle is a matter of minutes or maybe an hour from red back to green, from writing a failing test to making it pass. The acceptance test-driven development cycle is more along the lines of how long it takes you to implement a user story. And if you're using an agile approach, your user stories ought to be something that the team can complete in a day or 3. Right? So if you have an acceptance test, if you're doing ATDD and you're automating these things, you may write in the Gherkin, check it into the system, and that test is going to fail. It's going to fail for 3 days, but it's expected to. Everybody knows that it's going to fail, but you're expecting it to pass before the end of the sprint or by the time you finish the story. So I just wanted to point out that difference between TDD and ATDD. So unit tests in CI always pass. New specs fail in CI until the story is done. Okay, I just said that. Okay, so here's that ugly flowchart. And all I'm trying to do here is this side over here is the acceptance test-driven development, and this side over here is TDD. And so you add an acceptance test, you run the acceptance test, they fail, and that gives you permission to go code. So then you spend some time over here. You spend 3 days writing a whole bunch of unit tests in test-driven development and checking them in all the time, continuously integrating, and then finally you make the story pass and you run the new spec, the new acceptance test that you added, and it passes, and then you go through this loop again. So this is just to point out for those who aren't familiar with TDD versus ATDD, how they fit together. I start working on an acceptance test, and I'll go into this TDD cycle for a while until I can make that acceptance test pass. Different cycle time there. All right. So, is ATDD just regression testing? Well, I guess the answer is already on the slide. Regression testing can be full. You may need to do a full regression testing, and it may be slow, and you may only do it once a release. ATDD needs to be small, focused, and it needs to be fast, and you need to run it all the time. So no, ATDD is not regression testing. It does not replace your regression test. It's not the same thing. It doesn't have the same end in mind. So how about... Therefore, is ATDD better than regression testing? If ATDD is small and focused and fast, that's better. Better, faster, cheaper, right? It's better than regression testing. No, I say all the testers in the room are going, what, are you crazy? Yeah, help me out here. What am I missing? Well, it's not full. Yeah, we still need to do the full regression testing. And if you can automate that, fantastic. But before you go into production, I'm saying that ATDD is not a full regression test. It needs to be faster than that. And so it's less than regression testing, but it's more than regression testing because it's about gaining understanding and gaining clarity around your requirements. Okay, so the last D in the 4 Ds, it's really a poor choice of name, but they couldn't think of anything better that started with D. This isn't demo in the Scrum or Agile or Extreme Programming sense of the word demo. We're not talking necessarily about a demo to stakeholders. What they really mean is explore. They're really talking about all the other kinds of testing. So there's exploratory testing, performance testing, load testing, usability testing, information security testing, regression testing, break-the-box testing. All that other stuff still needs to be done. Just wanted to go on the record there that this isn't a replacement for the other things that you need to do. It's an addition. Now, you might say that because we have a strong suite of unit tests from TDD, and we have a strong suite of acceptance tests, then that can reduce the amount of areas that we need to test with the regression, or that can reduce this, or it can reduce that, or maybe it's a change in the balance of time that you spend on these various types of testing. But it doesn't totally eliminate anything. Okay, so what is this technique called? Well, here are many different names by which it's called. And, developers really don't like anything with the name testing in it, so maybe those aren't the names that we want to use. Maybe those aren't the best names. And it's really not about programming, and business and testers don't really want anything to do with development. So those names are out. Those aren't the best names. And it's some people hate Agile and they're sick of it, and you can see by the dwindling attendance in this room. They don't want to talk about it anymore. So if you name it Agile anything, they're going to roll their eyes, right? So maybe we don't want to call it that. However, I will say, if you're in the middle of an Agile transformation and management spending money on Agile training, then attach Agile to anything you want and it'll get approved. So, you can take advantage of it if you need to. And nobody likes meetings, so don't call it a meeting, call it a workshop. And, I'm just gathering examples. I just want to improve communication. I want to clarify requirements. Maybe I should have poked a little more fun and say nobody likes specifications because of nightmares of bad specifications. So that would take all the words out. So that none of these names are really good. Maybe that's why we have so many names for it. But I really like this idea of calling it specification by example, or executable specifications, or putting the focus on examples. Hey, as I said in the beginning, if you walk, on Monday, if I've raised your awareness to examples, and you can start talking about them and recording them and writing them down, and that's a win. So I like to focus on examples. So not about programming or testing, it's about understanding. A few miscellaneous items about test automation. Automation is software development. Don't think that you can do a record and playback and get long-term lasting value out of that, particularly if you're going through the UI, it'll be brittle. You got to get your programmers, or if you are programmers, you got to get involved in coding the test, both at the unit test level and at the acceptance test level. And if you wanted to automate tests for regression testing, you need to get programmers involved in that. Come on people, it's a company asset, these tests are, this automation. And you're investing a lot of money in it, So you need to use good engineering practices. It needs to be checked in, version controlled, understood. It needs to be clean code. You need to use solid design principles in your code, just as you would in your test code, just as you would in your production code. You need to refactor it, clean it up, and keep it maintainable. It's an asset that you want to invest in. Yes, sir.
So would those statements you just made apply to the give them and then statements?
Yep. Yes. Explain what you mean.
Well, so I think it's an interesting idea, right? So one of the things we've been looking at is introducing the BDD stuff, right, and actually putting it into our version control and managing it like source code.
Yes.
Even though it's not source code, right? We already manage our automation in source control, obviously. But the challenge with that, of course, is that the business clearly doesn't have access to it, so our developers end up playing a liaison role. But it does provide visibility to the dev team as to how these statements are refactored and grow. I think that one of the challenges we face when we use examples is that we're not always very good at identifying the hard examples early enough. And we identify easy examples early, which makes us have a false sense of security. And then as we get later, we're like, oh, that's an interesting example. And those then get introduced into the code base, usually during development, hopefully with automated tests written to validate if they continue to work, right? But I'm curious if you said what you just said, did you find other teams giving them when under version control, or is that?
Yes. Okay. Wonderful question, a wonderful comment, and I think everything you said adds a tremendous amount of value to the talk and to the time that we spent here. And I wish I could repeat it back. It was wonderful. Maybe I'll try to repeat a couple of points and then repeat the question and attempt to answer it. A couple of the good points was sometimes when you're doing this, you'll start out with the easy cases and you'll get a false sense of security, and then you'll come up with the harder cases later. And what do? Do you refactor them in? How do you refactor them in? Which kind of brings up version control and the need to version these things and track them, these specifications, and understand the changes and go back and look at the way it was a couple of versions ago and decide whether you need to roll something back or not. And I'm elaborating on what you said. You didn't say all of this, but absolutely, I think that's very important, versioning these things. But the other part, the flip side of your question was, yeah, but if you version them and then they're in Git or in TFS or somewhere and they're hidden from the business people, so you've got to solve that problem. And you can, it's a text file on a shared drive. You figure out how to put it in a wiki. You make it something you can click on to get out of Jenkins or Hudson or whatever, out of your build tool, so that they can see these things. Put it in a wiki if I didn't say that already. But absolutely, you've got to find some way that works in your organization to share these things with the business people, and also version control and refactor these things. One of the things that I want to make clear is that if you think about agile development and you're writing user stories, right? And I've kind of alluded to the fact that a user story may have snippets of Gherkin as its acceptance criteria. But what you don't want to do is take each one of those snippets directly from a user story, stick it in a file, and leave it like that. Because you don't want your user stories to show up in your product specification. The user stories are a thing that you use to guide you through development. They're transient artifacts. You don't need to go look at a user story that you developed 2 or 3 months ago. Every user story builds on all the other user stories. So a user story that I developed in January, I should not look at that and understand how, and expect to understand how the system works today, because I've had 10 other user stories since then that hit that same area and enhanced it. So what you have to do with every user story is refactor that new little snippet, that concept, into your living specification. So you're going to have a feature file for every feature of your product. You're going to have a file for that feature with the specification of that feature in it. And every user story hits that, And you've got to go refactor in, you've got to add in or make changes to the existing specification for that feature for every user story that hits it. So version control is important. And I'm just going to emphasize it one more time in case you missed it. If you look at your Gherkin specs and you see story 2575 something, then you're not doing it right. The user stories should be invisible in your specification file. Yes, sir.
I think it makes sense, though, for the Gherkin to go through a life cycle where it moves from different place to place. Like early on in the life cycle when we were talking about it, it would be referenced like directly in or from, say, Rally or whatever your ALM tool is, out somewhere where the business could see it. If they're Rally users, maybe right in the tool, or it could be a pointer to a wiki or somewhere else where it's stored. And then when it comes time to actually implement the story and automate it, then it moves into your source control. And it needs to be versioned with your code, because as your code branches, it may break tests. And so the executable ultimately must be branched with your source code, and it belongs in the source code. But before it's actually executable, it makes sense to store it in more of a textual format.
Yeah.
Right.
It took us a really long time to figure out what you just said, and it sounds stupid, right? But we thought of this originally like we think about acceptance criteria, which is that it's a business artifact, put it in a business tool, developers will reference it, right? And once we started versioning it, is when we started to get a lot more success.
Yeah. So that was a great point of clarification, and the point was that the specifications, the acceptance tests move through the life cycle. They start out being tied to user stories as snippets or pieces, and they live in your ALM tool. They live in Jira or Rally or version 1 or whatever. And as you implement the story, they need to move into the version control and into the automation. Thank you for that.
One other point you kind of glossed over too is that automating Gherkin is kind of two layers of automation. There's the writing the spec at the Gherkin level, which often testers can do even if they don't have scripting skills. They still do have to stick to the domain-specific language and get a little more strict in the writing of it, but it's structured English. And then there's some other code that has to bridge the gap between the statements in Gherkin and the executing of the system under test. And oftentimes it's the developer that has to do that on behalf of the test.
Absolutely. Yeah, I did gloss over that. When if you write these acceptance tests, the first time you run a new one through Gherkin, it's going to say, oh, I don't understand that. I don't know what that phrase means, and it'll create a little empty stub in the fixture code that you have to go write. A programmer's got to go write some code to manipulate the system that's under test, either to get it in a state that you want it to be in, or to trigger some action, or to verify some result. So it is absolutely coding. There's no magic here.
So even to go further with that, right? The other thing that's really hard about this is not unit tests, so they're not isolated. They're often not quick, right? So you run into all the issues of how do I get my given state to be true in my software? You know, even with techniques like dependency injection, right? A lot of times you're going to be crossing system boundaries, and you got to have a strategy, right, to clean after you run. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of complexity around the automation piece we found, where we find, honestly, right, that we don't automate a lot of these. We actually automate, we focus our automation on unit testing. We use these as a driver to establish credibility with the business, right, around what we're building.
Right. That's an interesting point. I guess it was maybe probably about 10 years ago, I was working with a group that was using fitness. And so they started out, they had the examples and they were doing the fixtures, and the business and the testers weren't looking at the examples and they weren't participating. So developers said, this fitness, all of this is just extra work and we're not getting any value out of it. So they abandoned fitness and they used a more technical framework to do their acceptance test driven development. And it was code. It was all the tests were buried in code, and they were harder to see, harder to understand, and nobody could look at them. But nobody was looking at it anyway. So So that kind of comes back to the point I mentioned earlier about really getting value out of it by engaging everybody in the process and in the tests. So wishful thinking is a useful state of mind, whether you're doing TDD or ATDD. The wishful thinking idea is, I wish the API did this. I wish the API looked this way. I wish the code behaved this way. I wish the product did this. And then you code it to make the test pass. Wishful thinking state of mind. Couple things about testing. I recommend testing underneath the UI and only test the things through the UI that really are only in the UI. Layout session, maybe some workflow. The page object pattern is something good to look up. It's an object to represent a page, hides UI details. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into a lot of that. References. Elizabeth Hendrickson is widely considered the go-to gal for this, an expert in all things agile testing. I like these books. I like Bridging the Communication Gap and Specification by Example. If you buy one of them, you can get the other one as a PDF for free. I like the Cucumber book. ATDD by Example is a bit specific. It gets into tooling and it gets into Java, and it's a little more hands-on. So I don't know, maybe it's more useful to you, but I liked the Specification by Example book a little better. That may be, okay, so here's a list of tools. Yeah, you can Google it and find a whole bunches. And this is such a not definitive list. There's no point in spending any time on it. Group your specs by stability and risk. Put the ones together that are more likely to fail versus the ones that are less likely to fail, and run these things in a pipeline. So at the point that it starts taking a long time to run these, you want to move them around, move the specs around so that this is just like all the other test risk management that you do. You selectively pick the test you want to run for regression testing. We'll do the same things with ATDD. Be able to move your specs around and run the ones that, if you're in a particular locale writing code, then run those tests more often, and run the specs for the code that you're not changing less often. So have a pipelining of in your build system. And again, I've already said user stories should not be visible in the specs. Okay, so that's all I wanted to mention to you. Do you have any thoughts or any other things that you'd want to add, things that I glossed over or missed?
Just want to add one quick thing about the fitness, which is a tool that I've been looking at. There's a plugin for fitness called GiveWhenZen, which does the Gherkin syntax. So you can do the whole thing with tables and Gherkin syntax in the same.
GiveWhenZen is a plugin to fitness? Yep. Very cool. Thanks for adding that. Anything else? Yes, sir.
One of the advantages I've found with ATDD is with moving testing up front is that it gets rid of the mini waterfall anti-pattern in Scrum. That a lot of teams treat each story as if it should be a waterfall within the constraints of the iteration. And depending on how exhaustive your tests are, you may be able to code right up until the afternoon at the end of your iteration and still get testing done because
you're not slamming QA at the end. Great observation. Just to repeat it, the acceptance test driven development and automating these things can reduce the waterfall fill or the mini waterfall that you sometimes feel inside Scrum, where you get your stories done and then a lot of the testing is saved until the end and you slam QA at the end. If you have your developers involved in automating these tests, you can test right up to the end, or you can develop right up to the end because you're also writing these tests, and it moves the testing forward, which is really, some people say that the difference between waterfall and agile is the big design up front and the big writing all your requirements up front. But I would argue the bigger difference between agile and waterfall, the more important distinguishing factor, is the late testing in waterfall. And that's what we're doing with Scrum and sprints and 2-week sprints, and getting the testers on the same team with the developers, sitting in the same room, working hand in hand, and all this automation is to de-risk your project and move that testing up earlier. Excellent point.
I've gotten a ton of value out of just getting a dev tester talking about examples. We were in a situation where it was difficult for us to get the product owner in the room at the time, but just getting that going on in the team, and all we really did was talk about them and just get it in the JIRA, kind of what we talked about and what those examples were, and that it diffused a lot of that tension that you were talking about in the program. That when the tester's kind of scared to bring the bug
right,
or whatever, that sort of disappeared because we all knew what it was supposed to do beforehand.
Cool. So yeah, the pairing of a developer and a tester, getting them to talk about examples before they get into it, builds a rapport, builds a relationship with each other, so that it's not contentious when a bug is found, because you've talked about the examples, and so hey, this example's failing. We talked about this. It's not my fault as the tester. It's not. It kind of diffuses a lot of that tension. So tell me a little more, Ken. When you got your tester and developer to talk about these, did you do it like every story, certain stories, in sprint planning, during development, before the sprint planning starts, or tell me a little more?
We actually did it kind of immediately following sprint planning, just prior to the starting of the coding or the writing of the test cases on the story. So we actually did it later than you had recommended, but it still was pretty helpful.
You did it on every story or some?
We kind of started out on every story, and from there we sort of got a feel for when you can maybe put 3 or 4 of them into one short meeting and just kind of tick the boxes off versus when one was going to be more involved.
So you got a feel for what stories you really needed to spend time on and which ones you could kind of group together. Cool. All right. Any other thoughts? Yes, sir.
So one of the things I think that you said was pretty interesting is you mentioned that you should create new specifications as part of the grooming process. And I know for myself, right, I perceive stories that are in the grooming process to be fairly disposable, especially from a splitting standpoint. We haven't put a lot of energy in committing to them. Yeah, we pushed the points, but we haven't pushed to this level of detail. So right now, we do this level of detail after the sprint starts, because it feels like anything we were to discover early in the sprint would be okay, right? If we figured, oh my gosh, we really didn't understand this story, it's all right, we'll blow it up or whatever. Talk to me about why you feel like grooming is the right place to do those activities.
Great question.
How you balance the commitment you put into it at that point?
Excellent question. The question was how to explain why I was recommending doing it earlier than after sprint planning. And so I'll backpedal a little bit and say that for your organization, you've got to figure out when to do it. And a lot of it depends on where you are in the predictability versus adaptability continuum. If your organization is making 6-month commitments, then you need to write your stories and be able to estimate them very early. And I don't want to invest time in this level of detail that far in advance. So in that particular case, I'm going to write a story and not have any acceptance criteria and estimate it relatively using points way in advance. And when we get closer to development, maybe right around sprint planning is a perfect time to come into this level of detail. If you're working on something, maybe it's a greenfield project, and the product owner's never worked with this team before, maybe you're doing some consulting work, and the business person really doesn't understand development very well. Maybe you want to invest in this process early on to make sure there's no misunderstanding when you're dealing with in a risky area. When you have a stakeholder who may not understand things, or there may be a bigger opportunity for miscommunication. So absolutely, your point is valid. You figure out the best time to do it for your team. And I am out of time, so thank you very much. I hope y'all enjoy the rest of your day and tomorrow.